I'm Leah Stewart. I am now the director of the Swanee Writers Conference, and I would have had Randall on faculty this summer if we had actually been able to have the conference. And I just had the painful experience of emailing all of the faculty who would have been there in 2020 to ask if they wanted to come back in 2021 and having to skip his name on the list. So I'm very sorry for the need for this occasion, but very glad to see you all here and very grateful to the people who are going to read. I thought perhaps we could use the chat to share some memories of Randall as people are reading. So if there's something, a story, a moment, something about Randall you particularly liked, some way he helped you with your work and you'd like to share that, please use the chat to do that. You'll also see in the chat an essay of Randall's that Annalena from Ecotone made open access so that we can all, I'm seeing some memories come in already, so that we can all read it. And Swanee, the official Swanee Writers Conference contribution to the reading will be my Associate Director, Adam Latham, reading from, briefly from a craft essay in a forthcoming book. But I just wanted to quickly share the first time I met Randall, which was not at Swanee, but at AWP. I was a graduate student. I was in my second year at Michigan. I was, I think, probably 22. And I had discovered Let the Dead Bury Their Dead and particularly loved Run, Mourner, Run. So I was teaching my very first, or perhaps it was my second, because it would have been in the spring. I was teaching my second creative writing class ever. And I was teaching that story. And I was at AWP feeling sort of shell-shocked and overwhelmed, as I'm sure many people still do at AWP, but you do, especially the first time. And Randall happened to get in the elevator and I recognized him from the book jacket. And so I was still fairly shy about speaking to writers that I admired, but I made myself step forward and tell him how much I loved that story and how I was teaching it. And I just remember that he did hit that Randall bow, you know, where he would sort of, and he would lean towards you like this and beamed at me. And I just felt very blessed to have taken that kind of step to speak to someone I didn't know, whose work I admired, and that he responded with such grace. And I find that when I think, even though I spent much time with him at Swanee in the years after that, I find that when I think of him lately, that's the moment that's coming to mind. Okay, Adam, do you want to go ahead and read from the craft essay?
Absolutely. As Leah mentioned, we're publishing the craft essay collection next spring with LSU Press. And I'm going to read an excerpt from Randall's essay that will be included. This came from Randall's first craft lecture at Swanee. Here is my true agenda, the confusion of the real with the actual. Those characters in both fiction and nonfiction who are based on actual flesh and blood people who become independent entities in their own right. Characters who outgrow an immeasurable actuality and achieve a reality all their own. I think it pays for writers to examine that peculiar transmogrification. I think it contains an energy we all hope to tap into. I am particularly interested and fascinated by those characters with roots in historically or journalistically real people, or as my philosophical friends would call, actual people, who attain another level of reality as either characters on the page or as fictionalized versions of themselves that outgrow themselves. There's a particular type of voodoo going on here that I feel the serious writer takes for granted at her or his own peril. What we are talking about on a fundamental level is myth-making. And I fear too, many of us contemporary writers feel that thinking about our characters, whatever their origins or inspirations, is mythological to be grandiose and outside our purview. I would ask you to rethink that self-limiting point of view. Thank you. Jennifer?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Thank you. So yeah, I'm Jennifer Grotz, and I want to start by saying thank you to Leah Stewart for proposing this reading today and this sort of joint collaboration. This is a first time, I think, for our conferences to do something like this. Randall Kenan was a beloved member of the Bread Loaf Writers community, and I know he was also a beloved member of the Swanee Writers community. And this event that we're having right now, I think, embodies just how powerful his presence was, not only as a writer and a gifted teacher, but also as a member of a community, the contributions that he brought to a community. The world is better for his having been in it. And he is still in it with his work. But I just want to say a word that, you know, in this extremely unusual time, or end times, who knows, but this moment of such divisiveness, I think it's worth remembering that how Randall models a sort of different way that one might be in the world, and what being a member of the community might be. And it's more than just showing up, as I think, you know, I'm seeing some of this coming in on the chats too, that part of it was that when I think of his presence, he was such a great listener as well. And he was accepting of difference, let's say, but at the same time, he was also someone that you could always find commonalities with. And I think that's going to come up a lot in this next hour or so. So I'm going to read a brief passage from The Eternal Glory That Is Ham Hocks, because one of the things I shared with Randall was what he might call a proper appreciation of a Southern mother's home cooking. This is just a couple paragraphs. My abandonment of high finance for food was not gradual. In fact, it came to me in a dream, very Old Testament prophet-like. Alone in my bed in my Riverside Drive apartment, I smelled a powerful aroma, so powerful from my childhood. Neurologists say that smell hallucinations are a telltale sign of schizophrenia, but I was well past the age of a psychotic break, past the average age at least. In my dream, I arose and walked to the kitchen, and there on the butcher's block, I didn't actually own a butcher's block at the time, but it seemed right that I would in this olfactory dream of mine. The sumptuous spread glistened and steamed, foods from my North Carolina boyhood undreamt of on the Upper West Side. Pig feet, sweetbreads, chicken feet, gizzards and livers and head cheese. There were sweet potatoes and tomatoes and collard greens and okra and squash and, yes, sweet corn. Before long, in walked a woman, naked, save for one of those pirate hats with great plumes jutting up and out and over. Vividly red it was, and full and large, which altogether is undeniably sexy, and which, for this narrative, would be a digression. Needless to say, when I awoke, it was the aromas, the sights, the warm feelings of the food that lingered with me most. I waited for a decent hour before I called my mother. Can you tell me how you cook your chicken livers? Baby, why are you cooking chicken livers at 6:30 in the morning? I thought you just had a bagel and coffee for breakfast. I know, Ma, I know. I just had a craving. Now come on, talk me through it. Thus began what my bosses called a slow descent, but my future teachers called my upward spiral. I can mark the day, practically the hour. Thereafter, I would call home almost daily, often before shopping and while cooking, to pick my mother's brain and to get her advice. I would go home more frequently to watch her in action, to see how she washed the greens, to see what she put in the water with her hog mauls, to learn her seasonings, her timing, her heat. I was learning a new definition of love. All right, that's my end. I don't know who the next reader is because the scrolling here.
I think I'm next.
It's Mia Alvar. I think it's Mia. Yeah.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm Mia Alvar, and this is from Randall's beautiful short story, What Are Days, from his collection, Let the Dead Bury Their Dead. Lena rose early that Monday morning. She drew a large tub of soapy water and eased herself into it, listening to the music that now matched her mood, Al Green, the slow night music, love music, sex music that had played over and over all night. After a time she stood, and while powder puffing her body and face, she looked over at him, lost in slumber. He had not roused, had not even turned over. A rough sleeper, his lean brown legs tangled among the sheets, his plump, bowl-round buttocks exposed, his head beneath a pillow. For a moment, she thought he might be dead. But staring at him from the mirror, she saw that he was quick, for his back rose and fell like a boat on a calm sea. A tawny arm extended to where she had lain, so young. She turned back to her mirror and saw herself, a mature woman of experience, a ripened woman, unmistakably. Perhaps she had thought that a baby man's love might transfigure her, magically remake her into one of the lovely young things in fairy stories. Lovely. She began to brush her hair, black with solid streaks of white. She squinted and felt a slight tinge of panic. She began to notice bags there, little puffs and wrinkles here, deep creases where the graceful lines had been. And am I really a good-looking woman? Was I ever? She took a very deep breath and sighed loudly. Lena stood, tying her robe about her, and walked over to the boy. A brooch rested on the table, the pin open. Swinging the pin all the way up like a hypodermic, she held the brooch over one of his sweet, sweet buttocks, paused momentarily to take in its rotund charm, its faint dusting of hair, and ever so gently stabbed it. Good morning. That Friday, the same day the boy came to her door like a lost and fallen angel, Lena had gone to visit Cannonball's grave. At first, she felt strange having her husband buried up north rather than back down south in Tim's Creek where they had both come from. But he had been an orphan, and the woman who raised him died when he was young. Lena herself had been an only child, and both her parents were dead by the time she turned 30. True, there were some cousins, maiden aunts, and protective uncles still living in Tim's Creek, but the ones she had known well were long gone. The others she hardly knew. She rarely went home now. So she decided to have Cannonball buried here in Newark. They had come to know each other here. They had fallen in love here. They had been married here. And here they would both lie buried. She had seen to that. To think of him made her tingle. From an early age, Cannon had been built like a bull. He had spent 10 years in the Marine Corps. He stood no taller than 5'10", but weighed well over 200 pounds, precious little of it fat. Thurman Cannonball Walker, the men had nicknamed him. Over in Germany, over in Korea, over in Okinawa, he had made a legend of himself, hell-raising, heavy drinking, womanizing. The men loved him better than the women. Even after he had been honorably discharged, he seemed to be always surrounded by men and boys and cigar smoke and uproarious laughter. He had driven a truck all over the country, his own truck, a shiny blue Peterbilt he had sweated and toiled for years to buy, so he'd be his own man, he said. She wanted desperately to be angry with him for leaving her a 47-year-old childless widow. She had tried to tell him, Cannonball, stop your drinking. Cannonball, stop your smoking. Cannon, honey, doctor says you gotta cut out the pork. Cannon, you know your blood pressure is high, baby. But how on earth could she bring herself to say no when he would pull in from Miami at 2 o'clock in the morning with a gigantic cured ham and beg her to fry some up? Cannonball just wouldn't have been Cannonball if he had lived any differently. How could she be mad at him for departing ahead of schedule? It was such an honor to know Randall and to know his work. So thank you, Randall. I think Jericho's next.
Thank you. I don't know who's after me, so if it's my job to tell you, thank you for telling me I'm next. I just was looking for the person in front of me. And now I feel responsible in ways that I did not feel before. Thank y'all so much for having me here. Big thanks to everyone who organized this. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Leah. I'm so happy that Randall Kenan put Bread Loaf and Sewanee in the same place at the same time. Only he could do that. When I was a very young writer, all documentation says the year 2000, but I really remember it as 99. Callaloo, an African-American journal of literature, put out an issue of queer writers. And I remember holding it in my hand like, what? What are they thinking? There's like, wow, and there are pages. It's like there are more than 2. It's just amazing to me. And that is where I discovered the work of Randall Kenan, which I thought was beautiful, but which also made me quite angry that I didn't know who he was before then, because I felt in so many ways that he was writing my life. He was a queer Black writer writing the South and its flora and fauna and its, its ways of being. And I felt so called out and known in his work. And there were certain scenes from my own life that he seemed to be rewriting in his stories. And I was angry about that. It's like I was going to use that in my poems. And in spite of the fact that these scenes were familiar to me in some ways, they completely surprised me every time I came across them in his work. And then years later, I was able to meet him. And I remember being so excited to meet him. And then when I met him, he actually knew who I was. And I was like, how does this guy know who I am? And then I got to know him over the years at conferences and other things. And I continued reading his books and sharing his work with my students. I learned a lot from Randall in a very special one-on-one way that is very difficult. I've been thinking about this ever since I figured out, people asked me to write about this and I felt like I couldn't write about it because of what it was. And all of you will know what I say when I say this. Randall Kenan was the most discreet person. I've never met anybody who could be so completely public and private all at once and could say what needed to be said in such a calm and understated way. And yet you would see all the valences of what he had said. And you couldn't be angry with him, right? And so it was, in the community, we call that shade, right? He would be throwing shade, but sometimes it would be the most positive shade that you had ever heard, I remember once I was leaving a reading and a writer had said some things in a piece that I was like, how is that possible that this writer is saying these things and everybody's acting like this is regular? And I too guess I should act like this is regular. And I was so upset and I walked out and I remember Randall saw me walking out and I was by myself and he said, Jericho. And he walked right by me. He said, that wasn't okay. I wonder what our options are. And he just kept walking. I was like, oh, there are options? You know what I mean? He would just do these amazing things that would have you rethink everything you thought you were going to do in a moment. And he was so, I remember we were in a crowd of people talking about relationships and someone was asking each person, oh, are you with somebody? Oh, do you have a partner? And the entire time they were talking, Randall was looking at me like this. Like he's just looking at me while the conversation is happening in the crowd. He's got his head tilted, and the person comes to him and says, "Randall, are you seeing anybody?" He says, "Is it Wednesday?" I thought that was so funny. He's like, "I'm not sure. Is it Wednesday?" I just thought that was so amazing. So he's one of the first writers that I had come across with whom I had those kinds of things in common. And I remember he would say, and he would, I don't know, he just showed me a way of being. And I before I met Randall Kenan, I remember I was like, oh God, I want to just look like that in my pictures. Like if I ever get to be a poet, a real poet, I just want to take pictures on the back of my book that looks like Randall Kenan's pictures. And then suddenly he had a beard. And I'll never forget, Randall Kenan grew a beard. And then he was on pictures with a beard. And I was like, oh my God, I need to grow a beard. So, and then my beard would never grow. I was so angry that I couldn't be Randall Kenan. Anyway, I'm gonna read y'all just a piece of that first story that I ever read by Randall Kenan. It's from that issue of Callaloo, and it's called "The Boy Who Played Cards with the Devil." And it has taken me forever to narrate it down to this, but I thought I'd start at the beginning, my beginning. Hey there, boy. Mr. John Edgar called to you. Got me a cow about to drop, and she run off in the woods somewhere. Reckon you got time to help find her? He sweetened the pot with the promise of a dime. It seems the laboring cow, after she broke through the rickety fence, had left confusing hoof prints. Did she go this way or that way? Either in the woods or across the road or down by the woods past the grape arbor and past the big canal there. Mr. John Edgar takes one path, you take the other. Sure enough, you see a sign where the cow had crossed over the dry gully and had made her way past the goldenrod and sagebrush. Down the trail on the other side, you follow till you reach an opening, and there a meadow, and there a cow. Already on its side, the cow let out a bellow, its hind leg high, the end of its canal palpitating, gushing, pushing forth. Already the snout of the newborn crowning like a piece of dark and wet wood. You stood mesmerized. You knew the farmer would be concerned about a breech birth. Even at 9 years of age, you knew that. Part of you figured you should go fetch Mr. John Edgar, but you wanted to see the event, horrible, violent, yet irresistible to behold. The cow let out another bellow, but this time somehow more resigned, and thrashed her entire body as if to get better grounding. By inches, the calf emerged, sopping wet, seemingly immobile. After what seemed time outside of time, the mass slid out with a gurgling slosh, and the cow delivered herself of her burden, and the dark wetness left her, and the mother struggled fast and away from it, then returning and commencing to lick the inert mass, which fidget by fidget, first with a quiver, next with a twitch, began to move and to bay an odd bird-like bleat. You watched with amazement while the fresh-licked calf attempted to stand. One leg, two legs, falter, topple, one leg, two legs, falter, third leg, falter, topple. Again and again and again it tried. Some immeasurable period later, the magic moment occurred and it stood free and clear, faltering but true. And you yourself uttered, "Oh," as the cow took its halting first steps, its mother now hovering over it with a stance that can only be described as proud. And you reluctantly went to get Mr. John Edgar Stokes, who would not name the baby. Who would not name the baby bull until it had reached a year and a half and had earned the name he'd bestow upon it many times over. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Gabby Calvocoressi, and I'm going to read Letter from North Carolina, learning from the ghosts of the Civil War. Randall and I teach or taught together at UNC Chapel Hill. And here's my dear friend. Dear ones, 'tis the season for toppling Confederate monuments. And this particular location feels as if it were the epicenter, the beginning, when students tore down the iconic statue at the front gates of the University of North Carolina on the evening of August 20th, 2018, leading to the confrontation between Klansmen and right-wing activists and fresh-faced students and the firing of our chancellor. Looking at the videos of cops manhandling and clashing with young people, Black, white, and Asian, feels prescient. But I can't help thinking of the lithe Bree Newsom, who climbed the flagpole in Columbia, South Carolina in 2015 and ripped down the Confederate flag as a galvanizing and generative moment. Yes, Black Lives Matter was a full-fledged movement by that point, but a certain focus had already begun to take over the young folk, and the memorialization of the Confederacy felt absolutely galling. It was galling before, but the idea that something could be done about the celebration of the lost cause had become imaginable. But it wasn't only about the Civil War. It was about Jim Crow. It was about Up-South Chicago and Detroit. It was about gentrification. I was an undergraduate here at UNC in the 1980s and walked past Silent Sam every day. It is not that I didn't see it or know its history. On the day of its dedication, a local millionaire, Julian Carr, who paid for it, bragged about whipping a Black wench until he shredded her clothes. Every Black student I knew that story, and it cut us to our core, yet imagining it actually coming down was not considered a possibility. The fact it would stand so arrogantly well into the 22nd century seemed an inevitability. That such righteous destruction would one day happen in Charlotte, Durham, Fayetteville, New Orleans, and ultimately Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, would have struck me as science fiction in 1984. The names of the racist generals would be stripped from 100-year-old buildings, the least possible. Our current chancellor has announced most of these buildings will now be renamed. Still, what I most would have struggled to imagine is that certain people would be up in arms were it to ever happen, that they would quite literally take over the state capitol building, bearing arms in anger to keep monuments up, that we might have another civil war over the matter. For me, a poor Black boy from the swamps of eastern North Carolina, the Civil War was far from a lost cause, let alone a done war. I had underestimated how unfinished. Most Southern states are host to many Civil War reenactors, many of them quite literate, supposedly sticklers for historical accuracy, who can argue about geography all night, but the fantasies these monuments and symbols represent don't embarrass them. I find this mystifying. They still defend these murderous, enslaving individuals, these traitors, even though, being such students of the War of Northern Aggression, they know full well these monuments were erected decades after the war had been won, not a lost cause at all, to bolster the big brother eyes of Jim Crow, to reinforce the notion of racial superiority. These statues are monuments to that war, not the war of Lee and Sherman and Grant. The coming war will not be about monuments, but the mentalities. Let's be clear on what the future war will be about. Why hold on to these antiquated notions of skin color signifying some type of superiority? Why cling to a past of loss and degradation? Those who fought for the Confederacy were clearly backbroken in the end. Why was holding other human beings in bondage a cause worth fighting for, other than money? When most of the white men who died for the Confederacy were poor as church mice. The convergence of Donald J. Trump, the coronavirus pandemic, the unrest over police abuse, and the tumbling of Confederate monuments were all unimaginable decades back. Can we seize the moment? We all must now readjust our thinking. The war has only just begun. Chapel Hill is a truly spooky place right now. It feels like a ghost town where 50,000 young folk used to play. Now only 1 or 2 students amble about the halls. The large, long campus is populated by a small percentage of their once robust population, or thousands thronged among the century-old federal-style buildings. There's nothing but grass where the silent statue once stood. The public safety officers who once wrangled teenagers to the ground like military police in a war zone are now herding them apart when they gather in crowds. The not knowing keeps everyone on edge. But the country's oldest public university is truly haunted by its mythical Confederate past. Even ghosts can teach us a thing or two. We miss you, Randall. The next reader is Amina Gautier.
Thank you, Gabby.
Oh. Okay. So I first met Randall in 2003 when I was a waiter at Bread Loaf. And I'm reading the last 5 paragraphs from his story, When We All Get to Heaven, which he read in 2012 when I was a fellow at Sewanee. And his reading of this story made this 2012 Sewanee iconic. People still gather and talk about it. If you've ever heard Randall Kenan do a British accent and pretend to be Billy Idol, you will know what I'm talking about. I am not going to do a British accent, and I'm not going to pretend to be Billy Idol because there's only one Randall Kenan. But I will bring out my brow cloth because this is in honor of dear Randall. So the part that I'm reading takes place when the character Ed Phelps has already left Billy Idol's concert and has returned to the hotel with his wife. He put on his pajamas, the fancy silk paisley pair Edmund had given him for Christmas, much too fancy for his taste and much, much too fancy to wear every day. But this trip seemed appropriate. He got into bed and waited for Isoline. The TV was on, the sound cut down, playing some Lifetime TV drama she was forever watching. Ed took hold of the remote and commenced to flip through the channels, hoping to find the Hitler channel or Discovery. Something caught his eye, and Ed Phelps paused, and there he was. He looked tiny there on the screen, and much younger than he had just a while ago, and so very white. All that white hair against such glowing white skin. He looked downright sick and pitiful. He looked like he needed to go home to his mama and get something good to eat. He was singing one of the songs he had sung earlier that very evening, the song about dancing with himself. And Ed Phelps still couldn't make heads nor tails of it and figured it meant something dirty, but just didn't care to know. Nor did he care for the beat, which was monotonous and straightforward and boring, and oh my Lord, in the music video, which made even less sense than the song, all these white folk who were supposed to be zombies or homeless people or such, in either event scary looking, he supposed, though they couldn't have scared a baby goldfish even if they tried hard, were climbing up this tall skyscraper to get at Billy, who was singing about masturbation or whatever on top of the roof of this building. There are puppets and all kind of random foolishness thrown in. And at the very end, Billy grabs hold of some electrode-looking thing and becomes electricity and shoots bolts of lightning at the pretty zombies, and they all fall down to earth from the super tall building. And Billy continues to go on about how he wants to dance with himself, and Ed Phelps is left to wonder about so many things. And the day makes more sense. And the day makes less sense. And he is happy to be in bed and have it all to think about, all to tell about, to Isoline, to Dr. Streeter. And he must remember to tell Isoline about the pastrami sandwich at the Carnegie Deli. The day weighed down on him, but the day was feather soft. The day was sweating bottles of water. The day was loud like cigars and smelled of truck horns. The day was a golden giant flying among the skyscrapers, delivering fire to a beautiful Latina. Oye, mama sa. Hot day, long day, sweet day, music day, and the day turned to a guitar, and the guitar strings turned to worms, and the worms turned into cucumbers, and the cucumbers turned into his mother's fingers, and she gave them to him peeled white with salt and pepper and a little vinegar, and the taste was childhood, and the taste was still new, and the sun was high in the sky, and it was 1946, and he was 14, and he was in the tobacco field and deep in the lungs, and the day was hot, but he was happy. Bacco! Bacco! Ain't no bacco in heaven, I know! And he heard his grandfather's voice, and his grandfather was singing, and he heard his grandfather's voice, and his grandfather was singing. Crystal Hana Kim is next.
Thank you so much, Amina. And thank you to everybody for putting this together. I met Randall last year when I was a fellow in his and Margot's class. And I can't remember if it was in the class or in one of his lectures, but he said this quote, "Redemption is a powerful current in fiction, and you can't have redemption without sin." And that craft point blew my mind, completely rearranged my novel, and is now driving my revisions. So I will always be just so grateful for Randall's wisdom. I'm going to be reading from an excerpt from the short story, The Foundations of the Earth. And this is from the short story collection, Let the Dead Bury Their Dead. And in this little piece, the main character, Maggie, she finds out that after her grandson has passed, that he was gay, and she's meeting her grandson's partner. Maggie McGowan Williams woke the next morning to the harsh chatter of a blue jay chasing a mockingbird just outside her window, a racket that caused her to open her eyes quickly to blinding sunlight. Squinting, she looked about the room, seeing the chest of drawers that had once belonged to her mother and her mother's mother before that, the chairs, the photographs on the wall, the television, the rug thickly soft, the closet door slightly ajar, the bureau, the mirror atop the bureau, and herself in the mirror, all of it bright in the crisp morning light. She saw herself looking, if not refreshed, calmed, and within her the rage had gone, replaced by numb humility and a plethora of questions. Questions. Questions, questions. Inwardly, she had felt beatific that day of the funeral, ashamed at her anger of the day before. She greeted folk gently, softly, with a smile, her tones honey-flavored but solemn, and she resumed the mantle of one who comforts more than needing comfort. The immediate family had gathered at Maggie's house. Edward's father, Tom Jr., Tom Jr.'s wife, Lucille, the grandbaby Paul, Edward's brother, Clarissa. Raymond Brown's long black limousine took them from the front door of Maggie's house to the church, where the yard was crammed with people in their grays and navy blues, dark browns, and deep, deep burgundies. In her new humility, she mused, when, oh when, will we learn that death is not so somber, not something to mourn so much as celebrate? We should wear fire reds, sun oranges, hello greens, ocean deep blues, and dazzling welcome home whites. She herself wore a bright dress of saffron and a blue scarf. She thought Edward would have liked it. The family lined up and Gabrielle approached her. As he stood before her, raven-haired, pink-skinned, abject, eyes bloodshot, she experienced a bevy of conflicting emotions: disgust, grief, anger, tenderness, fear, wariness, pity. Nevertheless, she had to be civil, had to make a leap of faith and of understanding. Somehow, she felt it had been asked of her. And though there were still so many questions, so much to sort out, for now she would mime patience, pretend to be accepting, feign peace. Time would unravel the rest. She reached out, taking both his hands into her own, and said, the way she would to an old friend, "How have you been?" Thank you. The next person is Margot Livesey. Thank you.
Thank you for these beautiful, beautiful readings, heartbreaking readings. I can no longer remember when I first met Randall. One year I came to the Sewanee Writers Conference, and there he was, and we were both staying at a place called Rebel's Rest, and a rather unfortunately named Rebel's Rest, and also sharing a classroom. So, and year after year at Sewanee, I had the huge privilege of sharing a classroom with Randall, of benefiting from his wonderful, his humor, his insights, his conversations about politics and sex and food and life. He was one of the best read people I'd ever met, and he was also one of the most politically aware and politically engaged people I have ever met. And I could complain to him about British politics as if we were fellow British people. And of course, he often made fun of my accent. I'm reading from the ending of a story in Randall's wonderful new collection, If I Had Two Wings, which came out in early August. The story is called Now Why Come That Is. And there is no way I can do justice to this, but I think the words will sing anyway. Percy raised his head to the door, and as he knew it would be, there stood his hog, insolent, inquisitive, mocking. Percy sneered at the beast, thinking and then saying out loud, for none would appreciate this outsized drama more than he, like some celluloid cowboy show in his brain. End of the line, fella. Percy had the hog in his sights right between the eyes. They both stood there, stock still, for a period of time Percy could not easily name. Percy and the hog and Percy. The hog did not move, and by Percy thought, what a magnificent creature. Unaccountably, he began to tremble, and inadvertently, he peered into the hog's eyes, into the depth of them, perhaps towards the soul of it. And to Percy, it seemed the hog did the same to him. Percy's trembling increased, and a feeling began to wash over him and into him, and Percy began to feel puny, naked, ashamed. Just as he had at that moment when he discovered that his penis was not the largest in creation, and that the juice of his testicles would neither save nor solve humanity, neither save nor solve himself, that all he had, he and his father had stolen and robbed for, and that he had no right to any of it, that he was next to nothing, and that the mask of his flesh, once glorious, now wrinkling and withering, would in time be dust and ash, and that he was really not very, very much at all, not even as valuable as a hog. Percy began to cry. He could not shoot. He would not shoot. He should not shoot. He understood in this moment of pregnant possibility, this showdown, this climax of it all, what the hog was. And in a moment of quiescence and acquiescence, Percival Malcolm Tyrrell let it all go, let the gun slip from his hands and slumped to the floor of his study, a feeling like exhaustion settling into his bones. The great boar hog on scuffling hooves came rushing and leapt, springing impossibly up into the air. And Percy, in chilled fright, watched as the mammoth creature sailed like a gargantuan football towards him, and he could only shield his face with his hands and quake. A few instants later, he heard Rose run into the house calling, "Percy, are you all right? My God, Percy." He slowly uncovered his face to see only the open window, a breeze gently troubling the sheer curtains inward, barely a billow. Percy continued to sob, though the sob had altered in its tenor and meaning. Now the sob was a sweet, deep, wonderful, and profound sob, his body shaking, snot running down his nose. Rose walked into the room, but Percy did not really see her or hear her. So intent was he upon this newfound and peaceful feeling. He felt just like that bird in the old Hank Williams song, the one too blue to fly, and tried to mouth, "Hear that lonesome whippoorwill," but only the mumblings of a child emerged. Lonesome, oh, so lonesome. The next reader is Jill McCorkle.
Thanks. It is such a great honor to be among you, and I just wish that Randall was with us. He leaves a huge hole in every community he graced, and he graced many. He grew up in a small place in southeastern North Carolina. Few have traveled through, but you know the place because you've seen it on the page. And as much as Randall courageously faced the history and the ghost of that place, as you heard from the last piece he published that Gabby read so beautifully, he also was very often drawn back in life and on the page to those earliest memories of his childhood, the nature, the food, and the hands of those he loved and those who loved him. So this is Chinkapin Elementary Particles. It's from a collection on place called Amazing Place. The Kenan family farm, Chinkapin, Duplin County, North Carolina, United States of America, continent of North America, Western Hemisphere, the Earth, the solar system, the universe, the mind of God, 34.8 degrees north latitude, 77.82 degrees west longitude, 39 feet above sea level. The Northeast Cape Fear River, creeks and brooks like lacework across the land, defining fields and forests, the northernmost edge of the Angola Swamp, home of Venus flytraps, longleaf pines and oak and sassafras, maple, sweet gum, cedar, laurel, magnolia, myrtle, shortleaf pine, pitch pine, pond pine, eastern white pine, loblolly pine, sycamore, cottonwood, chokeberry, hemlock, elm, pecan, and walnut trees, orchards, apple, pear, plum, scuppernong grape, arbors, weeds, and wildflowers and grasses, poke salad. The American chinkapin tree was practically wiped out by the chestnut blight between 1905 and 1940. Raccoon, possum, squirrel, field mice, insects, frogs, tadpoles, crayfish, crawdaddies, lamprey eels, catfish, bats, rabbit, deer, bobcat, muskrat, black bear, alligators, chicken snakes, rattlesnakes, king snakes, black racers, coach whips, hognose snakes, green snakes, garter snakes, coral snakes, milk snakes, corn snakes, cottonmouth moccasin, corn, soybeans, cotton, cucumbers, strawberries, sweet potatoes, peanuts, hogs, cows, more hogs, lots of hogs, chickens, turkeys, even more hogs, indeed more hogs than people, mules, already so few by now in the 1970s, tobacco, tobacco barns, tobacco pack houses, tractors, combines, plows, discs, trucks, truck beds, the billboard, you just missed it, half mile back, Miss Sally's Diner, churches, First Missionary Baptist Church, St. Louis Baptist Church, Sharon Baptist Church, Chinkapin Presbyterian Church, St. Mark Church of Christ, Mount Horeb Pentecostal Church, Church of Deliverance and Restoration Pentecostal Church, known affectionately as Holy Rollers. Cemeteries and sparrows and thrushes and robins and cardinals and the occasional egret or heron. Quail, bobwhites, hummingbirds, hawks, blue jays, mockingbirds, woodpeckers, turkey buzzards. Stores, Speaker Thomas's grocery store, Billy Brinkley's grocery store, Parker & Sons General Store and Supply, M.L. Smith & Sons at Mill Swamp, known by everyone as Luther Jim's, the glorious ruins of a 19th century train station, 2 stories, paint gone and done and slowly falling down, the top balcony stubbornly holding on, defying gravity, the physics of collapse, burned down by the Chinkapin Volunteer Fire Department in 1981. The long abandoned rails of a train created to haul lumber at the turn of the 19th century, rusty, overgrown, yet still there, even now. Bank, United Carolina Bank, closed in 1987. United States Post Office. Schools, Chinkapin Elementary Number 1, formerly the Black School. Chinkapin Elementary Number 2, formerly the White School. Football, basketball, baseball, mascot, the Indians. 4-H Club. My mother's garden, snap beans, Kentucky wonders, pole beans, butter beans, field peas, okra, cabbage, collards, mustard, Irish potatoes, carrots, sweet, sweet, sweet like candy. Best straight from the earth, the dirt is good for you. Beefsteak, tomatoes, cucumbers, onions, garlic, cayenne pepper, bell pepper, sweet corn, beets, watermelon, begonias, wandering Jew, dahlias, zinnias, geraniums, roses, sunflowers, black-eyed Susans, snapdragons, azaleas. There is more, much, much more. Scents and taste, the color of things, the sounds of laughter, the sound of dirt landing upon coffins, hymns, pop tunes on the radio, first loves, Vacation Bible School in June, murders, and talent shows, the time the carnival came to town. And for me, Star Trek and Charles Dickens and Batman and the Swiss Family Robinson and Spider-Man and Treasure Island and The Hobbit and the intense desire to be elsewhere. How could I have forgotten blueberries? And yet a funky good allegiance and gratitude. Chicken pen, North Kakalaki. Smile when you say that, fella. Memory is a Polaroid. Thank you, Randall. And next up is Michael Parker.
Thank you so much, Jill, for reading that. Randall and I grew up about 20 miles from each other in extreme rural southeastern North Carolina, as Jill said. And I first met Randall in 1982 when we were in a fiction workshop at UNC. And so I've known him forever. We would see each other over the years, and we would talk about this or that. You know, Randall would talk, he could talk about anything, but we would always end up talking about where we were from. We would always end up talking about home. No matter what we had started out with, we'd always end up home. And Randall would always call it our contiguous swamps. That was the name for where we came from. So I wanted to read a passage from The Fire This Time that is rooted, as Jill's piece was, in Chinkapin and in our contiguous swamps, and also gives us a sense of Randall's character, which seems to have been perfectly formed at the age of 3, which shouldn't surprise any of us. Redden Hall was a tobacco farmer. He raised hogs and chickens as well, but tobacco was his main cash crop. Mama had inherited land, and along with her own acreage and some that he leased from others, he ran quite a large operation. He was a tall, sturdy, red-boned man with a jolly and inviting face, easy to smile with a purposeful gait, a gentleman in his early 50s. Among my memories while he lived, driving soon in the morning in the pitch black to Wilson, North Carolina, to sell cured tobacco. My first taste of Vienna sausages in his truck parked in the middle of a field, pink they were and salty. My first spanking, how it affronted me for having the temerity to move a shovel I was told not to touch. Eating sauteed onions with just salt and pepper, a flavor that still haunts me and causes me to think philosophical thoughts. His lesser son surprising me while I played on the grass when the horse he was riding gently nuzzled me from behind. 3-year-olds should never be startled face to face by a large beast. How could I forget such things? One day, Mama and Redden and I were out by the barn. Redden had an adult son from a previous marriage, Billy, the very image of his father, light skin, light eyes, booming voice. That day, while the men and Mama conversed, I played under the grape arbor, lost in whatever 3-year-olds tend to lose themselves doing with sticks and stones and worms. To my surprise, I heard Redden's tractor start up and drive away. I thought Redden had taken off and left me behind. When I ran to see, there I saw Billy, now riding away in the distance down the dirt road, waving at us. I stood aghast, having clearly digested the notion of ownership and theft, though not their nuances, and I pointed toward the stolen tractor and hollered, "The rascal!" This story was often repeated during my childhood. Perhaps this is why and how I remember it so well. In those bygone days, after tobacco was harvested, it was cured in large barns, hung from rafters and slowly cooked for about a week by the heat of propane burners aligned on the ground. When they became brown and supple and valuable, the leaves were carefully removed and stacked in great mounds and tied in bales of burlap and then taken to what was called a pack house. Near the end of the season, as the summer began to wane, women would be dispatched to the pack house to separate the leaves according to quality. This process was called grading. I remember that particular late September day, Mama brought an old quilt made by her mother for me to play on while she and the ladies went about their task. This pack house was an old residence, a small gutted house of only a few rooms, packed full of dry tobacco. I wandered about watching in the dusty rooms, asking primary questions, inhaling the sweet tobacco musk. Not very long into the morning, my uncle said he wasn't feeling all that well. He was feeling funny. My mother spread out the quilt she had brought on the front porch for him to lie down on. I remember thinking, "You brought that for me." I remember saying, "That is my quilt." But generosity or some sense of sharing overcame me, and I just decided to keep my uncle company and lay down next to him. I think Mama told me to watch over him while they worked. He went to sleep beside me. By and by, one of the ladies came to check on him. he wouldn't wake up. I don't remember exactly when I stopped being afraid of the dark. Thank you. I think Wyatt Prunty is up next.
Oh, Wyatt, you're muted. We see your face, but yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, thank you.
No, I didn't need to be speaking, really. I was having a real good time listening to all of you. I'm reading 3 short paragraphs from the end of the character of our character, which is the piece that Adam mentioned earlier that's was contributed to a collection of essays. Swanee is publishing with LSU in the spring. And it has sort of, I think this has kind of a summary effect. I'm reading the paragraphs out of order. Maybe it'll work. I hope it does. The danger today of nonfiction supplanting fiction, anxiety of the reification of the real over the imagination. I do not share that anxiety, though I recognize a lot of nonfiction writers are outwriting a lot of fiction writers these days. I think what happened is that in the wake of the aforementioned new journalism crest in the 1960s, writers like John McPhee discovered how to mythologize places like the Pine Barrens, learned from Joseph Mitchell how to make the truth rise up to mythic proportions, how to make fishermen and truck drivers and grocers loom in the imagination the way warriors and Holy Grail chasers once did. I think some fiction writers abdicated their birthright and got lost in the weeds of literalism and quotidian fact and burdensome logic, and lost sight of those things about the human condition that most excite our imagination. Mystery, the intangible, the mess of it all, the human spirit. Then he began that sequence, the first of the 3 paragraphs. I leave you with this paradox to ponder. Character is more than the sum of the parts, and yet you get no character without knowing all the various and sundry parts. You can't leap over those constituent ingredients, and yet the making of a woman or a man or the page transcends that catalog. That is the rub. The rub right now is we miss you, Randall. That's it. And I'll go quiet again.
Thank you, Wyatt. Adam Vines is next.
Hey, I brought my brow cloth and I'm wearing a suit in Alabama at this time of the year, so something special has happened. And the reason I'm wearing a suit is because the last time I talked to Randall, I guess about 2 years ago, I guess, at Sewanee, he came up to me and he said, as he always has for the past 10 years, Vinyez. And I said, Randall, because we like to play with each other when it comes to accentuations, when it comes to our names. He said, what have you done this year? And I said, I turned 50, Randall. And he said, what'd you do? I said, I bought a suit. And he said, why'd you buy a suit? And I said, because I think I'm becoming an adult now. And he said, good man. So I'm wearing that suit right now for Randall, and I'm sweating. But I've got my brow cloth, and I'm going to read a couple of things by Randall. First, I'm going to read something that he wrote for the Hopkins Review about Barry Hana. And this was right after he talks about reviewing Hana's collection right after he had published his first short story collection. In truth, I'd reviewed Barry's story collection, Bats Out of Hell, for the Boston Globe when it first came out in 1993. I adored the book and essentially said so. But as book critics are wont to do, I mentioned the stories I found to be of lesser impact. I'd never met Barry Hana, but had heard stories of his ability to be quite the madman, bringing guns to school and laying them down on a desk in front of him, attacking people with bows and arrows, probably more myth than reality. I thought then, though now I know better. The next year, I agreed to do a reading in New York City at the 92nd Street Y, and soon learned I was to be paired with Barry Hana. As you can imagine, this meeting provoked a great deal of anxiety in me, but I had no cause for worry. Not only was Barry Hana a gentleman of the highest order towards me, but I discovered that night he was also a virtuoso reader of his own prose. Listening to Barry give a public reading was witnessing a tour de force. Barry could deliver a story with a calm quietness like a Yo-Yo Ma solo, steady, sonorous, yet underneath, as with the best of Bach's inventions, a simmering, symmetrical heat, built and built. His unusual sentences, part Thomas Pynchon, part Flannery O'Connor, spoken with his guitar-strung Mississippi accent, left listeners spellbound. And the sheer force of his storytelling, by turns insane, throbbing with wild humanity, tender mercies, and withering insights, had the audience wild with laughter. Barry loved himself some Bob Dylan, he told me, and others, on many occasions that his favorite album was Blood on the Tracks, the source of the title of his last book, Yonder Stands Your Orphan, came from the Dylan song, It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. One conversation I regret I never got to have with Barry over on the porch of the French house was what he thought of Dylan having won a Nobel Prize. I think he would have approved. And I've been thinking about missing those nights on the French house porch with him as well. I'm going to read the first few paragraphs of Clarence and the Dead. We both shared a love for swine, and I just got kind of embarrassed because people kept chatting with me and saying, "What are you eating?" And I was eating Slim Jims. I'm sorry, I got a little hungry, but everybody talking about swine, I couldn't help it. So I ate 3 Slim Jims. On the day Clarence Pickett died, Wilma Jones's hog Francis stopped talking. Now, of course, no one else had ever heard the swine utter word the first, but Wilma swore up and down that that creature had first said to her, "Jesus wept," on a sunny day in June. But the peculiar thing was that Wilma had not known of Clarence's death when she declared the hog's final hushing up. And oddly enough, it was on the exact day of Clarence's birth, 5 years before, that Wilma had commenced preaching that the hog could talk. They said that day the sun shone while the rain poured. The old folks say that's when the devil beats his wife, the day Estelle Pickett died giving birth to Clarence. Her mama was out on the cucumber patch when Estelle went into labor and came to get her. Miss Eunice, not being an excitable woman, asked if the midwife had been sent for, and when we said yeah, she insisted on topping off her bushel before heading home. Estelle's papa, Mr. George Edward, was away in Wilmington that day, looking for a new tractor since he was sick and tired of his old farmall breaking down every other row and needing more oil than gasoline. We never knew if Miss Eunice blamed herself because she never admitted to it. 1 and 2, we never saw much sign that she did. We all arrived at the picket place at the same time as the midwife. We walked in on one of the most hideous sights we can remember, seeing or hearing tell of. There lay Estelle on the bed, her legs apart, her eyes rolled back in her head, her body kind of twisted to the side in a pool so deep red it could have been a maroon sheet she was sitting on instead of white. And on the floor, squalling like a stuck pig, was Clarence, a twitching, pitiful little thing, in a soup of blood and purple mess and shit. There wa'n't no call to worry about being over his face as people came to gossip. Just not so. The call seemed to be everywhere else, though, on his head, on his hands, on his belly like a raw liver, quivery and oozy, him coated in a mucky white paste like snot. A nasty enough mess to make you lose your breakfast. Miss Eunice went to fix him up straight away, and the midwife looked to Estelle. She's gone, child, poor thing, she said. Well, Miss Eunice didn't say anything else, but that well seemed to say everything and nothing. She handed the baby to the midwife to cut and tuck his stem. Folk who said he didn't have a belly button just don't know what they're talking about, because we saw it nodded. Thank you, folks. And who is next? I just got all entranced in that. I'm sorry.
Our last reader, thank you, Adam. Our last reader is Daniel Wallace.
Thank you, Leah.
Thanks, Adam. And thanks, everybody. This has been remarkable in so many ways. I think it's done exactly what a service is supposed to do. It recreates the person that you're reading about and talking about, and it does feel like he's here. There's this composition that happens when all these words come together. It's like the magic that we see in his stories. And the word that's been spoken most often today is myth, and his stories are mythic. They're folk tales in the tradition, and listening to them feel like they've already been folded into the culture as stories that children would read in school. And the memories, Jill reading that list just reminded me how much he loved lists. Loved lists in fiction, where they are, amazing, and loved lists in life. And also in that list were all those snakes. And there was nothing that he hated more than snakes. And every time I would find a snake or see a snake, I would take a picture of it and send it to him. And so he hated that and would react violently to that. But finally, I would take pictures of vines that look like snakes or sticks that look like snakes. And I have come across 2 snakes since he died. And, oh God, those are the things that make you, miss somebody so much more, because I can't send him pictures of snakes anymore. So I worked with and played with Randall in Chapel Hill for the last while. And I want to read from a really short chapter from his novel In Progress. There's a man going around taking names. The novel is long, and I don't know where this chapter resides within it, but I think it can be read and enjoyed and admired without any explanatory preface. It's called Ox. Esmeralda Parker McElwain's first child, born in 1899, they named Tabitha Elsa. A boy child, my great-grandfather, born in 1901, was named, grudgingly, Increase McElwain. They would come to call him Ox. By the time he was 15, the young son stood over 6 feet and would grow 6 more inches by the time he reached his majority. By his 16th birthday, he weighed well over 250 pounds. Precious little of it fat, so strongly was he built that there could have been no other nickname. Despite his great size, the young man had an almost sweet demeanor, quiet, injuriously shy, so withdrawn as if to be ashamed of his giantism. Stern like his great-grandfather, mysteriously withdrawn like his grandfather, and like his father, it seemed he harbored some deep inner question upon which he puzzled, some dark central enigma for which he sought some complex and healing answer. Restless, yet oddly calm. Sometimes, for days, he seemed to lose the power of speech and would ignore his family members sitting upon the porch or under the walnut tree. Sometimes he would walk off into the woods and not return for a day or more, never explaining, never even mentioning his absence. By and by, the family accepted his weirding way. He wasn't hurting anyone, after all, they figured. All seemed well with the towering lad until one autumnal September evening during his 17th year. There she sat, next to her mother, the legendary Clytemnestra Cross, come to visit her kinfolks. Psyche, all of 14 and a half, her thick mop of black hair curly and shining in the church light, her lips as delicate as a spider's web, her butterscotch cheeks. The sight ensorcelled the young man to the point that when the last sermon was ended and the last offering collected and the last hymn sung and folk commenced to socialize and mill about and take their leave, when he tried to speak to her, to say howdy, his tongue clicked and his mouth went as dry as a tobacco barn. But once robbed of her delicious presence, the usually taciturn McElwain spoke so long and so much of his vision, his seraphim, that his running mates begged him to hush up. Clytemnestra Cross and her 3 children and her husband lived in Asheville in those days and rarely came to York County, especially considering the brouhaha over her marriage. But Ox would get word about her blessed daughter from one of her cousins. Over a year after that first glimpsing at First Baptist Church, Ox McElwain took off without a word. At first, none gave it a second thought, seeing as how he could go away from time to time. But after a week, it became apparent that this time was not like the others. 6 weeks later, he returned with his 16-year-old bride. Perhaps his heart had not yet completely calcified. Perhaps looking upon his gargantuan issue, the senior increase McElwain remembered his own young love throes, recognized the thunder of desire, for he quoted the book of Luke. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and gave his blessing to this new union in the McElwain clan. Years went by, and Ox seemed to settle down upon his return. By all accounts, he grew into a level-headed, good-natured, dependable, upright man who did more than his share of work around the farm and helping out others. He sired 3 children by Psyche until one day in 1933, while picking cotton, he stood up, stock still, and faced the horizon, the sun blazing in his eyes, and he began walking. He was indifferent to the calls at his back. Ox, where are you going? Ox, what's wrong? And he looked back not once and walked till he vanished entirely from view. He was not seen again for 37 years. When he returned in 1970, like a bad omen, he returned as he had left, walking. He walked straight into town, walked his way to the family house, up through the yard, beyond the house, into the wood behind the house, where, after a time, he constructed a small one-room cabin by himself and alone. When anyone was fool enough to inquire as to where he had been, what he had been doing all those years, the old man would simply say, "None of your goddamn business." Thanks.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you so much to all of you who read. That was really moving. Such wonderful selections. I'm really grateful to Jen and Noreen from Loaf for helping us put this together, and to Adam and Gwen, the associate directors at Swanee, for helping put this together. and to all of you for being here and giving us a moment to remember and celebrate Randall. Miriam Berkeley, for those of you who can hang out one more second, Miriam Berkeley, who photographed Randall a few times at Swanee, wanted to show us a couple of photos of him.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me? I first met Randall actually in 1988 when he was working at Knopf. I heard about his book that somebody at Knopf had written a book, and he met me on his lunchtime and we took a few photos. So this is the first, I hope you can see it. This is the first time I photographed Randall. Higher, this is the first time I photographed Randall. As you can see, I think he was extremely handsome. And higher still, okay. Now, okay, and I think he looked kind of like a movie star. That was 1988, he was 25 years old. The second time I went to UNC for an event and photographed him, and this was one of the photos from UNC, 1996. Up higher, 1990, lower?
I know.
1996. The third time here, I don't know exactly which year. I think it was his first year at Swanee because his beard is dark. He's got the beard though. It's not as full as it later was. I think I photographed him another time, but this was 2013. And this is the picture on If I Had Two Wings is from this series, 2013. I think we did pictures after that, but I don't know where they are. So I've seen, this was Randall over the decades, from a young man to a middle-aged man. Unfortunately, he never got to be an old man. Anyway, I feel like Randall was with us today. So thank you, Leah and Adam, and everybody for organizing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam.
Yeah, again, thank you, everyone. And if you didn't see them in the chat earlier before you log off, Annalena gave us access to an essay. And the link is in the chat. An essay by Randall that was an ecotone, and Adam Latham posted the link to our playlist of readings and craft lectures by Randall over the years at Swanee, and I believe the ones that the reading, for instance, that Amina mentioned should be in there. So if you want to find those links before you log off, please feel free to scroll through the chat and see that. And thank you also to everyone who posted these lovely memories of Randall in the chat, and also expressed appreciation to the readers. I appreciate all of you. And I think at moments like this, I'm reminded of how lucky we are to have communities like Swanee and Bread Loaf. And I'm really grateful to have them, and also that we could bring them together today. So thank you again, everyone.